Hey everyone, this episode is going to be unique in two distinct ways. The first is something that you're probably familiar with, that it's going to be very short and will therefore be paired with another episode on release, just like last time. The second unusual bit is that this will be our first squib episode. I concocted this notion as a means to cover firearms we have not yet been able to fire. Often we spend years looking for a gun to demo for the show, and then right after the episode releases, we're offered two more of that exact gun. That's because people who own them turn up to watch a video on something that they are familiar with. Well, since our show is somewhat compartmental, if we have an example in hand that I cannot fire but can display, well, I can at least get through the usual history lesson and skip the May and the demonstration and the final conversation. You get the idea. If we ever do get to borrow a firing example, then we can just film those segments and drop them in for a finished overall primer episode. This will allow me to cover guns we know of in museums like the Fiat Ravelli or the Sant'Etienne 1907, and hopefully later flush out the firing segments. Today, however, we're using this squib process on a rare bolt action, and our example is just in too poor of condition to shoot without harming the piece, and yet the owner does not want to restore it either, as the extreme wear is likely part of its unique history and should be left undisturbed. So, just to review, this is going to play just like a normal episode, but there will be no shooting segment, and there will be no Mauser at the end, and the entire point is to bait out those two features so that we can eventually cover everything. You're going to see more of these, and usually with bigger guns. We've started down the path of the 98 Mauser in warfare, and while the guns are often similar, the countries and their acquisitions are unique. So today, let's talk about Serbia. Hi, I'm Othais, and this is the Serbian rifle model 1910, perhaps the best Mauser 98 military rifle ever made. Well, before we decide all that, let's get a look at it in the light box. Weighing in at 9 pounds and with an overall length of 48.9 inches, this is right in line with all the other exports we've seen. It chambers the 7x57mm cartridge, again familiar, and as adopted by Serbia. The magazine capacity is 5 rounds, staggered, stripper clip fed. As is tradition, we need to review some history here and reflect on just where we left off with Serbian small arms in the last episode that covered them. They had adopted the Mauser 1880, often called the Mauser Coca, a black powder single shot with a unique 10mm cartridge and progressive rifling. Next up, they would skip the line in adopting a Mauser 1893 pattern rifle, but it took a few extra years to secure funding, and that would ultimately arrive as the model 1899. The 99 introduced the 7mm Mauser cartridge to Serbia. This Oberndorf invention was a fast-moving, flat-shooting honey of a bottle-nosed cartridge, a good choice all around. Having adopted the 1899, Serbia ran into problems. They were having case head separations and rear toe blowouts on those cartridges. The rifle chambers were either bored too deep or their ammunition supply wasn't quite up to snuff. The solution was simple either way though. Pull the barrels, set them back one turn, and recut the chamber. But while they were at that, why not make a solid improvement? On the original 1893, the barrel screws into the receiver directly, presenting a flush donut-shaped face to the bolt. The need to actually extract a case necessitated leaving just a bit of unsupported case, though this was the most reinforced and strongest part of it. Serbian engineers could do better though, and milled a recess in the barrel breech, allowing the extractor further forward while still supporting the majority of the previously exposed case. This was likely an inspiration to Mauser, who included a sort of shroud in the receiver of the later model 1898, which was an attempt not specifically aimed at case support, but as a gas seal with the bolt head. Now, as you saw in our Gewehr 98 episode, the 1893 Mauser was no longer the king of martial rifles, even as Serbia was adopting it as their 1899. And while they did the aforementioned breech upgrade and further improve the rear sights, The eventual 9907 pattern just wasn't perfect, or at least not as good as a solid 98 rifle. Doesn't seem to have affected it much in terms of combat potential though, but what did hurt Serbia was the limited numbers of these guns that they could acquire. Basically, without going into terrible detail, Serbia was always looking for more and better armament, but the first step of that process wasn't arms testing or trials, no, it was finances. Being next to Austria-Hungary wasn't easy. The Habsburgs had been trying to gobble up every bit of the crumbling Ottoman Empire they could, and Serbia was just not theirs, but it was a magnet for other territories in the regions who were looking for a pan-Slavic beacon. Serbia was a problem for Austria-Hungary, and thanks to politics and geography, the old Doppel-Eagle was also Serbia's biggest trade partner. You can see how this would go over poorly. If you would like a little more detail than that, I do recommend actually checking out our previous episode on the 99 and 9907 rifles for more details on Serbian arms development. The 1910 that we have today is a small part of that overall story. Turning to 1909 specifically, the Serbian National Assembly managed a French loan for 150 million dinar. 95 million was dedicated to weaponry specifically, everything from pistols to artillery. The last rifle contracts had been with OEWG, and since they were just 2 years earlier, the tooling was probably still in place for them to receive more of their standard frontline infantry rifles, but that would mean further dependence on Austria, with whom they had a major beef. Well, okay, maybe a major pork, because the French loan came in just after and in likely response to the Pig War. Suffering the effects of material dependence on Austria-Hungary, Serbia had begun purchasing other armament from other powers like France. This led Austria-Hungary to attempt to damage the Serbian economy by banning importation of a major export, Serbian pork, and other products. Serbia responded by further improving their domestic packaging and production with the help of France in particular, and began exporting to other markets. This independence was even worse for Austria-Hungary, so they gave up around 1908. But the damage was done. Serbia would not be buying firearms from Austria-Hungary. They were going elsewhere for sure, especially because this loan was not tied with Austrian strings. They'd turn back to their old friend at Oberndorf, Paul Mauser, who had sold them way back when their first official rifle. Initially the 99 had gone through DWM though, and then the 07 through Austria, but now they could return to Mauser, who had actually moved away from producing the 1893 pattern rifle that they had wanted. He had something fancier. He had sold the pinnacle of Mauser bolt-action technology to Germany, the model 1898, and was now producing it for commercial export. We saw the standard pattern just last episode with its full-length stock, half-length handguard, and tangent rear sight. Heck, it was already being produced and shipped in 7x57. When you can buy an off-the-shelf option, you save money, and Serbia liked that, so they would adopt the Mauser 1910 with their own unique requirements. While it still had the Mauser 98 internal gas shield, they also wanted it notched for the extractor like their 07 had been, and so the Serbian 1910 has a truly unique bolt and breech face. And with that, this gun was born, so I think we can finally get a closer look. Alright gang, we're getting pretty used to the idea of a semi-pistol grip, metal butt plate, sling swivel. Ooh, look, a commercial Mauser mark that you can barely make out there. And then, of course, the Mauser 98 action, and despite how innovative and fantastic it is, it does mean it was used everywhere, and so we're probably getting a little bored of that, but you get the idea. Flag safety, cock on open, usual things that we've seen in previous episodes. A commercial banner and a handful of Serbian marks. That makes this an actual 1910 for Serbia. As we get forward, this is my great disappointment because we have a flat tangent rear sight, and I cannot tell whether or not this was supposed to have an alternating button. It's resting in an alternating click phase, but unfortunately, this system is worn out. And if you know anything about Serbian combat in the Great War, there's a reason why it's worn and ratted out. This gun is as it should be, and so we are not going to be going in there and repairing it and trying to figure out whether or not this was an alternating button or a press both buttons situation. We're gonna see why I might be confused about that in our next episode. So let me get this on our side. I'll point out again, no stock reinforcing lugs, 7mm Mauser does not beat up the wood. come on down, and we have our mid-band and a cracked spring. This gun again was rode hard, and we're gonna walk her forward, and we see an 1893 style bayonet lug instead of the more modern 98 pattern that allows for backwards compatibility with the 99 series of rifles and saves Serbia from making any unnecessary changes. I'm sure it worked just fine, although in this case, again, it has suffered the trials of time. It would have had a clearing rod that is also missing from this gun. As you can see, she's milled down at the front to take a narrow muzzle ring on that bayonet. So despite being a very plain looking bolt action rifle, again, I want to point out that there is one critical difference in the bolt, and I'm going to zoom in on that in just a second. All right, I'm holding two bolts, and if you are eagle-eyed, you can spot the Serbian. Look right here and look right here. Do you see how pronounced this is? This is a regular Mauser 98 pattern bolt. This, which is much more flush at the face, that's the Serbian, and that's because this sets down deeper up against the front of the, or up against the rear of the barrel. And that means that this extractor gets a chance to bed in a little bit, and therefore you don't need that extension to support the left side of the case. This is the Serbian, that's the 98, which is why you can't really find a replacement bolt for a good Serbian Mauser. A lot of people will tell you, oh, you have an intermediate length Mauser, oh, you have a full length Mauser, a small ring, or they come up with all these rules about which bolts fit where, and then something like this happens, and you really get confused because these turn up in various conversions of Serbian guns later on in the Yugoslav area. So be careful swapping parts, guys. You don't always know what it is that you're getting, and you can end up with some unsupported case head if you're swapping these bolts around and you're not aware of these critical little details. Now, wild. Looking a bit closer, we can see right here, yep, commercial crest, which is something we're not quite ready to talk about, so I'm gonna save that for a little bit further into the episode. Since we saw the one major change between this and the 98 as issued by Germany, I don't think we're going to need a fresh animation. Instead, we can get right over to the good stuff. Hey guys, just a reminder, this is presently a squib episode. The rifle we have available is not fit to shoot, and if you have one to loan that we can go back and get a little data on it, well, let us know. But until then, you're just going to use a little imagination. However you're encountering this episode, originally it was recorded without a shooting segment, so I actually don't know how to react, but one day I hopefully will. In the meantime, let's dig back into the history. 32,000 Model 1910 rifles would initially be ordered from Mauser Oberndorf, which is inscribed in Serbian on the side rail with these characters. This first contract bore the Serbian crest and the Model 1910 inscription, of course standing for the contract starting in 1910. This order would be fulfilled in 1911. But as you can tell from our gun today, there would be another billboard. Plain commercially marked Mauser Oberndorfs were also purchased. Unfortunately, it is not known when or specifically whom this additional contract was made. We know they are Serbian, however, thanks to the Crown Oversea acceptance markings impressed into the steel. Serial surveys put the number of commercial guns at roughly 5,000 as we understand it for now, but until a paper trail appears, it's very uncertain just why the plain Jane guns were made. There is a theory, though, that the guns were purchased specifically for the Chetniks in Macedonia, Kosovo, and Metohija. There are certainly photos of them with the easily spotted 1910 thanks to that proud semi-pistol grip. I should also point out a few hundred carbines were also produced, a number so small as to be practically insignificant. It's believed these were offered up either free or inexpensively in an attempt to develop another auxiliary rifle contract. Despite being the most modern rifle in Serbian inventory, the Model 1910 was not the most common. They actually had more converted from black powder to smokeless than they did of this guy right here. So it seems their best gun was relegated to the second Bahn, that's of 3 Bahns. We actually covered this in our previous Mauser 1899 episode, so again, give that a watch if you're confused what a Serbian Bahn is. Now, being second tier might have kept them off the front line in the larger army, but Just after delivery, Serbia found itself in a series of conflicts. The First and Second Balkan Wars saw Serbia fighting very effectively against the Ottoman Empire and then the Bulgarians. Given the number of units fielded, I'm going to say the 1910 served right up front and center, though to what extent is unknown. Now, whether or not the commercial model like I have here was available for the Balkan Wars, that's unknown. It could have been pre or post. It could have been overrun from what they already made. It could have been later. They kind of have their own serial presentation though. I suspect that Serbia was still fairly lightly equipped, and while victorious, they did not really enjoy much of an advantage coming out of the wars thanks to the exhaustion of troops, supplies, and loss of some arms in combat. That'd probably be a good reason to buy another pack of rifles. They didn't get much chance to recover though before war were declared. And now we definitely know the 1910s made it into the front line. They kind of had to because Serbian arms would be almost completely exhausted in this conflict. While both the 99 and 1910 were extremely good rifles and wielded by Serbian infantry, provided empire-embarrassing firepower, eventually the sheer weight of Austria-Hungary, Germany, and Bulgaria would fall on the Serbian shoulders, and retreat and collapse were inevitable. The Serbian forces quickly exhausted their men and rifles and would have to be re-equipped by the Entente. Serbian forces would soon have more Mosin 1891s and Berthiers than any of their Mausers from before the war. The troops found them to be inferior on both counts, but weren't likely to go unarmed instead. It's interesting to consider that two of the best rifles of the Great War were in auxiliary use. I've already spoken about one, my love for the Arisaka Type 38, and how it was at best a second option for Russia, and now we have probably the best version of the Mauser 1898 in the war. Every improvement of the export model and a better breech fit, 100% safe and absolutely reliable, and it was still considered second line for a smaller power and fielded in low numbers overall. Meanwhile, it would be completely replaced twice over by one of the least impressive repeaters available, and the key word is available. The cruddy gun you have to fight with beats the masterpiece you don't, I suppose. Well, since I cannot separate out the 1910 specific service history from the overall fight, I'll just invite you to again take a look at the more extensive 1899 episode for Serbia's overall experience. If you've done all that and you've watched all this episode, well, congratulations, you can finally get Miss Mae's opinion on shooting the model 1910. Well, that is after she shoots it.
Hey guys, Mae here. Just wanted to say thanks again to John for letting us borrow his toys. We greatly appreciate it and you. Also, as a reminder, this is one of 2 episodes that has been released today, so go check out episode 113 of Primer. Finally, if you have a moment and are still in need of some holiday gift ideas, go check out our shop. Our glorious Russian shirt is still available in most sizes, and our Winchester 1897 themed patches are still up for grabs. Links are in the description. Y'all have a good one, and happy holidays!